Hello, everyone. We're going to start in 2 minutes. Give everybody 2 minutes to pile on, and then we'll start the book launch. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the launch of our Warming Planet, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation. We have timed this book launch to coincide with the release later this month of the IPCC Working Group 2 Sixth Assessment Report on Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. In many ways, this book that we're launching today could be seen as a companion volume to the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report of Working Group 2. This is the agenda for the day of our, let's see, and I'm not, for some reason, not being able to advance my slides. So to give the agenda, let's see. I think I better stop and start again. Manishka, shall I do that? Maybe I better do that. Let's try again. Here we
Yes.
go. It's not advancing. There it is. Okay. Here's the agenda for the coming hour. We're going to introduce the book and the editors and the author and the publisher. David Rind is going to give a talk on how the climate is changing. This is like, what's causing these impacts? What's influencing the impacts, and what climate things do we need to adapt to? And then, unfortunately, we have to announce that Martin Parry, unfortunately, his household has been struck with COVID, and he won't be able to join us, but he has sent best wishes to everyone at the launch, and the authors and everyone on the launch participating. And he has sent a presentation, which we were going to share with you. And then we're recording the whole session, so we will then be sharing back with Martin. Then Manishka Demel, it will moderate a live Q&A session. We want to get to that for sure, because we want it to be a discussion. And then we're very happy to introduce Rosalba Giarratano, who is going to be describing some educational resources that NASA education program is developing along with the book. So that's our full agenda for the next hour. So here's the book. The book is very special because it's truly lectures in climate change. So the more than 30 authors have created lectures on key topics in climate change impacts and adaptation. So altogether, there are 500 electronic slides, all downloadable. Then the slides have supporting notes, and then ahead of the lectures, there is the background text from the leaders in the field. We first, right now, want to thank our publisher team, because working with the World Scientific Team has just been amazing over the couple of years that it took to make this book. So thanks so much to Max Fua, who's the publisher of the company, Svi Reuter, the senior editor, Amanda Yun, the fantastic production editor, and Jason Lim Chongjin, who is who's working with us on outreach. So that is the book. Now the introduction of the editors. So just so happy to introduce to everyone. Many of you know Martin Parry already, and I'm going to do a little bit more on Martin's contribution, because the book was organized to be in some ways, virtual festschrift of Martin's contributions to the field of impacts and adaptation. So I'm going to give a little bit more of that in the next slide. But I'm also so happy to introduce Manishka Demel, who at our institute, Goddard Institute for Space Studies, leads the research pillar, we call it, on conservation and development. So the three of us really did the editing part with all the great contribution from the authors, and the authors are going to be introduced shortly. But let's turn first to just highlight Martin's amazing research career. I won't read every bullet on this, but just to highlight a couple of things: that he was the founding director of the Environmental Change Institute, now such a thriving research center at University of Oxford. And then, of course, highlighting his role as the co-chair of Working Group 2 for the fourth assessment of the IPCC. So that's a brief span of his amazing research career, but we wanted to highlight a few of his research contributions. So starting in the upper left, this is his seminal work, the beginning work that looked at climate risk frontiers in relation to the climate changes in upland Scotland on the farming communities there from 1400 to 1800. So this idea of the interaction of the climate risks and the changing climate risks was what Martin worked on from the very beginning of his career. He then spread out, widened to look at all climate variables, not just cold, but heat, cold, wet, and dry. In the work that he did at YASA, that he led at YASA, and what we call the blue and the orange books, and also widened the geographical scope to be really worldwide. And then on the right is just to highlight his very wide contribution to IPCC, not just only being the co-chair of Working Group 2 for AR4, but also that we found this, which was work that he spearheaded to provide technical guidelines for assessing climate change impacts and adaptation. And this was a special report to the first Conference of the Parties of the UN FCCC. So just to show the depth of his contributions. Now, and finally, another part, and the final part about his career, amazing career, is the way that he marshaled the research community, many of the authors of the book, to work together. And that's what this photo outside YASA shows. And if you look closely, there are some, Martin is there, but also some of the authors of the book, including Tim Carter and Carlos Nobre. So that's a brief tribute to Martin's career and the motivation for the book. Now, let's go to the top of the book itself, the topics and the authors. So there are 5 main sections. Of course, introducing the climate that David is going to share in the next talk, methods and approaches for impacts and adaptation, impacts, of course, on sectors, still very highly relevant today, and of course, different regions and countries. And then finally, the linkage to policy and practice, so important today. And you can see that the authors, and we're going to now turn on the gallery view so that the authors can wave and say hi. But I just want to say that the authors, many of them have been authors of IPCC Working Group 2, and some of them are still authors of IPCC. And just we are so grateful to every author for their contributions to this amazing book, because it is truly, you really are the leaders and the founders of this field, of our field. So I think, Manishka, right now we're going to do a gallery view so that we can see the authors.
Yes, we can.
Great. Oh, I have to stop sharing. That's right. Okay, there you go. All right. So here are the authors. Can everybody wave? Great.
Hi.
Yes. Wonderful. Terrific. All right. Then And then I think what we can now do is turn to David Rind, who's going to give a talk on, well, what's up with the climate that all these impacts and adaptation are part of. So David, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Cynthia. Hello, everybody. Obviously, climate change impacts research would be nothing without climate change. And fortunately, our climate is changing. That is a facetious comment, as you realize. This presentation is about what climate changes we know are occurring, what the potential future for climate changes are, and what we do and don't know currently that would impact climate impacts research. So these slides are from the latest IPCC report, and in very distinct fashion, they give the mean temperature change estimated from the year 0 up to the present. And you can see what in the past has been thought of as a hockey stick curve, and is even more so now, with the observed temperature changes increasing so rapidly over the last few decades. On the right, you sort of see estimates that have been made for what the contribution of the natural forcings are, which is basically nothing, compared to what the human forcings are. And they are, in effect, giving you basically all of the observed temperature changes we've seen for the last several decades. Now, mean temperature changes don't actually help all that much with respect to climate change impacts, which tend to be much more local and tend to also be more associated with extremes. The next picture shows various future trace gas scenarios that depend upon choices mankind makes. IPCC had 5 different scenarios, low-end scenarios that most people feel are just fantasy, a high-end scenario that people also don't believe will actually happen because it would involve perhaps even more carbon than is available in the system, at least at this point. These middle pathways are thought to be most likely, though perhaps something in between them is also potentially likely. This is for carbon dioxide emissions as a function of time. Other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide also have their own scenarios, 5 different scenarios. And for aerosols in the atmosphere dominated by sulfur dioxide, aerosols tend to cool the climate, and you can see all these scenarios have us cleaning up the air. Fortunate in one respect, but not so fortunate in terms of mitigating climate warming. These are estimates in the latest IPCC report for the 5 different scenarios, what in terms of mean temperature is likely, the best estimate, and the range in the next coming decades, 2021 through 2040. And what you can see is that the best estimate is practically independent of scenario. Basically, 1.5 degree warming is baked into the system now, though with some degree of range, and the range is a little higher with this high-end scenario. And this is because the ocean takes a long time to respond, so that in fact, the ocean already has this 1.5 degree warming implicit in it, which will eventually emerge almost regardless of what we do, at least in terms of these scenarios. But you start to see some differentiation when you look at the next several decades around the middle of the century. And if the goal is to keep the warming below 1.5 degrees, from this estimate, that's unlikely to happen. If the goal is to keep it below 2 degrees, then if you go to the least active scenarios, you can perhaps do that, though with the range, even that is not necessarily the case. If you think this is the most likely scenario, it would get to 2 degrees by 2050 as the best estimate. And then for the later part of the century, things obviously, you have much greater divergence in what the mean temperature would be. And these are obviously truly catastrophic temperature rises. But even this, if some people consider this the best estimate, even this is approaching 3 degrees by the end of the century. A sobering representation of where we're at. Again, climate change impacts are often associated with extremes, and a 10-year event is how often you would expect an extreme in temperature. Compared to what you can think of as almost pre-industrial, the 1850 to 1900 time period, we're already 2.8 times more likely to get an event that normally happened once in 10 years, now would be 2.8 times in 10 years. That's with the 1.2 degree warming. And as you can see, when you go to the higher values, for example, 2 degrees, it would happen 5.6 times every 10 years. Similarly, a 50-year event, which occurred once every 50 years, currently is now close to 5 times or 10% of those 50 years. With the 2 degree warming, it's up to 14 times. And if you want to scare yourself with a 4 degree C warming, it's 40 times out of the 50 years. Similarly, other things that would affect climate impacts and already are heavy precipitation over land. Instead of once in a 10-year event in pre-industrial times, it's a 30% increase, 1.3 times. And with 4 degrees, it would be almost 3 times in 10 years. And for agricultural and ecological droughts, a 10-year event, which would be once every 50 years, is now 70% more likely, 1.7 times, 100% more likely with a 1.5 degree warming, and so on and so forth, 300% increase for 4 degrees C. The choice of how often we experience these extreme events is very clearly represented in our estimates by what does happen to the mean global warming, and that really relates to the trajectory of trace gas releases that man chooses. As to the general question of what climate changes are important for climate impacts and how well we know them, well, for temperature, the general trends in the near term are fairly certain. We now have a number of years of observations, and we can see how temperature has been increasing. And we also seem to know how much heat is now being stored in the ocean, so we can estimate what's going to happen in the near term. In the far term, it obviously depends upon both the climate sensitivity of the system, which we don't actually know very well, and the political sensitivity of how man reacts. We also are fairly certain that increased heat waves will occur, and in fact, they already are, though the locations are uncertain. And you can see over the last 20 years, these heat waves have popped around, obviously being in the West Coast, the US and Canadian West Coast the last year. For precipitation, the general trends, unfortunately, are somewhat uncertain, except that the air will be able to hold more moisture. So on a time average, though, there will be more rain. But where the rain will fall, the general view is that the phrase, the rich get richer and poor get poorer, areas that already get a lot of rain may very well get more. Dry regions may dry further. While increased precipitation rates, how heavy the rainfall is when it falls, that's very certain, and it's occurring already. Even in New York, an increasing amount of rainfall greater than 2 inches is occurring, even though the rainfall totals themselves are not necessarily changing. We're also fairly certain that there will be an increase in short-term droughts, again associated with heat waves, but the locations for that are uncertain as well. Storms, which affect climate impacts, we're not really sure how the tracks of these storms will change, though it's thought that it's most likely, especially in the southern hemisphere, they will move poleward, hence away from Australia and more towards New Zealand, perhaps in the North Pacific as well. We don't know how these so-called winter or extratropical storms will change in intensity. It's fairly certain that hurricane intensity will increase because the hurricanes generate energy associated with the sea surface temperatures, which are warming. And also their duration may last longer in terms of the rainfall, because that depends on the moisture in the air. And as the climate warms, there is more moisture in the air. We don't know how their frequency will change, nor exactly where the change in paths will be. For winds, which affect climate impacts, that depends on how the intensity of storms change, and so it's somewhat uncertain in the extratropics. For anything that relates to cloud cover change, well, you're out of luck because we certainly don't have a good feeling about how clouds will change. And since it affects climate sensitivity, that's why the climate sensitivity itself is somewhat uncertain. For snow and sea ice, it's not a good future for the cryosphere in general. Both snow and sea ice will be decreasing and are decreasing already. This will be more certain as time passes. There are time periods now when snow actually can increase. This would be in regions that are cold and the warming is not enough to bring it above freezing, but it is enough to allow more moisture to stay in the air. So under those circumstances, snowfall can actually increase locally. But on the long term, the freezing level will be moving poleward in both hemispheres. Sea level and ice sheets. Sea level increase is certain. It's been going on, and as you probably know, it has been accelerating. It increases associated with the warming of the oceans, which by itself raises sea level, and the melting of glaciers on land. In particular, the increasing uncertainty of magnitude as time passes relates to the uncertain contribution from the melting of ice sheets. And if there is any factor in the climate system that has the potential for doing the most damage and is completely, pretty much uncertain at this point, is what the future of ice sheets will be. These assessments need to be done on more local levels. Climate models are getting better at producing finer resolution results, but as many people have said, precision and accuracy are not equivalent characteristics. So just because we can get to more local levels doesn't mean we have a great deal of confidence as to what will happen locally. That confidence could be gained if there was convergence in what will happen among the many different models. And in some respects, convergence is happening, but that is a goal for the future. Hopefully it will get better with time. Finally, just as a summary for the book series, as Cynthia mentioned, these series called Lectures in Climate Change. This is the second volume of this series. Volume 1, Our Warming Planet, came out several years ago. And its focus is topics in climate dynamics. It's more sort of related to Working Group 1 of IPCC, the science of climate change, but it goes through a number of different aspects of climate. Many different fields are covered. This is volume 2, Our Warming Planet. There is a volume 3 on clouds and radiation, and it will actually be available relatively soon, this year, 2022, I'm sure. Each volume, as Cynthia mentioned, consists of 20 to 25 lectures. Each lecture has a 5-page discussion associated with it, plus around 20 PowerPoint slides and associated notes. The goal is for the general education of people and also in particular for the use in the classroom, which is why the PowerPoint slides, as Cynthia mentioned, are downloadable. It's available as a hardcover book, and you can then get the slides online or as an ebook with slides. There also are webinars associated with the respective chapters given by most of the authors. So they will be providing lectures using these slides and any supplementary slides they want, so that people will have at least the author's point of view on what the information means to help in any presentation they themselves would like to give. These are live presentations, which then are recorded for viewing. So this is the backdrop for climate change, what we know and what we don't know. And now I'll stop sharing and pass it on to Cynthia, who will be doing Martin's presentation.
Thank you, David. Yes, it all starts with the climate. Of course, many other socioeconomic things too, for the social scientists, a part of the members of the authors. But let me go to now, I'm going to get down to Martin's talk, which he's provided. And again, for those of you who joined late, unfortunately, COVID, we are still in the time of COVID, and COVID has struck his household. But so I'm presenting, what I'm presenting is really his take on climate change impacts and adaptation. So that's, I think, very interesting to see what pulled out as wanting to share at the launch. And it's also this which I'm going to give very briefly, but all of this is recorded, all of this will be online. It's also a preview of the webinar series. We weren't able to show something from every 25, each of the 25 lectures, but Martin has pulled out some to give a flavor of what they're like. Oh, and I do want to just also, before I start in, I want to hold up the real book because not only is it electronic and all of that, of course, in this day and age, but it's also a beautiful book. So I just want to say it's very real. In the real and virtual at the same time. So here we go for Martin's take on what's new in impacts and adaptation. What really is embodied in the lectures book. First, better knowledge of altered climates, including of extremes. As David was saying, there is now much more understanding, and the impact scientists have worked on that as well. More detailed geography of impacts, and importantly, the dynamics of impacts between sectors. So it's not just the silos of the sectors themselves, but also their interactions. Of course, continuing work on understanding vulnerability, and now more than ever, building resilience, and an integrated assessment of responses. So it's not only the dynamics of impacts between and among the sectors, but it's also, the book discusses, some of the authors discuss how we integrate the assessment of the responses as well. Clearly now we are at the beginning of the implementation phase of adaptation. So monitoring of real adaptation responses, absolutely crucial. So we can get the lessons learned from that as the implementation of adaptation gets going. We have also a wonderful consideration of community-based adaptation with one of the co-authors. I think we have a slide of that with our colleague Salim Huq, and who's one of the authors there. And then also crucially important and very important for Martin's work always to building the new knowledge and taking it into the realm of policy. Now we're going to do the flying view through the lectures. So first, this is a global view of how runoff may change. This is in Joel Camus' chapter of lecture 9. And so you'll be getting announcements of when the full lectures will be in the webinar series. Here's from wonderful work by Pam Barry on biodiversity and the role of nature-based solutions. Here's the Downscaled, the chapter the lecture on Downscaled climate projections by Linda Mearns, with examples from the global models on the top for the UK and the regional models below. So very fundamental tool and important chapter in the methods section. Tim Carter is going to be giving one of the 2 kickoff webinars. David's going to give a fuller discussion of the climate, and Tim is going to lead us to really share the analytical approaches in research in the field, the top down, the bottom up, how they're coming together, what are the trends in the research, delving deeply into what how the field is advancing. Robert Nichols on sea level rise, always one of the very key impacts in for coastal areas. So he'll be providing the sea level rise webinar. William Travis, who's I believe with us today, work on using empirical data, the farmer and extension agent testimonies. So the data bringing in narrative and survey data, interviews with and social science techniques about one of the key questions is how for the agriculture, since that's my home field, how zones may shift. But I have another home field now. Some folks may know. I also, because our institute is in New York City, I also work on the role of cities in impacts and adaptation, so they're really emerging as key actors. And so there'll be a lecture on climate change, impacts and adaptation in cities and their role as key actors. I mentioned this with Faisal Rahman and Salim Huq. They really founded the field of community-based adaptation. So absolutely, really important deepening extension, of course, of the field, a tremendous contribution. And then, of course, also on the most very vulnerable places in the world, John Hay on sea level rise and coastal issues, and also then moving forward, how do we include these resilience into harbor development? This is from Nabua Mimura in Japan and co-author in Japan, and I believe Nabua is with us on this launch, linking the policy to the impacts adaptation and then to policy in Japan. And then finally, I think this is the last one to emphasize in Thea Dickinson and Ian Burton's one. I think they're like the 25th one, which is, okay, how do we bring it all together for policy and go forward? And one of the things, they put this fantastic graph of the adaptation literature and the explosion of it, and this was just for AR5, and now in a few weeks we're going to have like the new thousands that have come that are going to be assessed in AR6. So our field is, you can see in the beginning, very really small getting started, and now there's such an explosion of realization, really, of the importance of impacts and adaptation. So the book ends with emerging directions, pulled really from all the work of the contributing authors. Just to highlight a few that are both in the book and that are happening now, is this whole issue of action research. How do we research what's actually happening in real time? Very challenging. This integrated system approaches that we have to really increase, deepen, understand, and work with the complexities of the systems, and across and look across systems as well. Metrics and evaluation. How are we going to measure adaptation? This is a huge topic now, because how can we learn if we can't measure and evaluate how well the adaptation interventions and strategies are doing? And finally, the scaling up challenge of policy and finance. What research needs to be done that can actually then enable policymakers and financial donors and governments to actually scale up to the level of adaptation that is really needed, to coming full circle to the projections that David Rind explained to us and presented to us so clearly. So this was Martin's presentation that he sent, that wanted to share with all of you, and we're happy to do it, and we'll also be sending back the whole recording to Martin. So I think now I stop sharing and I turn over to Manishka, right? For
Yes,
our live Q&A.
So great to have everyone with us. We have over 100, actually 125 participants, which is excellent. So, we have people joining from across the world. So we would love to get to know our audience first. So in order to get to know all of you a little bit better, we've prepared a few just 3 short polls. And I'm just going to put it up for about 30 seconds. And please vote, because that way we'll get to know each other a little bit better. So let me just launch the first poll. And there you go. I'll give everyone some time. And in the meantime, we'd also like to know a little bit, feel free to introduce yourselves as well. So please share, if you wish to, please share your name, your country, your institution, role, how you think this book and webinar series will help you, so that we can all get to know each other a little bit better. And if you would like to share your email, feel free to do that too. So chat that into the chat box, and very soon start thinking about the Q&A as well. Great. I'm going to end the poll. And okay, I'm giving it a few more seconds. And I'm ending the poll right now and sharing the results. So it's good. We have at least one person from every region, and then quite a lot, unsurprisingly, from North America, but really great to see people joining from across the world. Then we'd like to know a little bit more about the sector you work in as well. So I'm going to launch another quick poll, and I'll give everyone about 30 or 40 seconds to do this. Great. Just a couple more seconds and I'm going to end the poll. Once again, we seem to have a good representation from a range of sectors. Great. And then we have just one final question. We would love to know more about your involvement in climate change work. So another 30 seconds or so for this, and then we can dive right into the Q&A session. So do start thinking about your questions, and feel free to start typing your questions to the Q&A box. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can. So far, we're seeing at least half the participants who are directly involved in climate change, but there are also people who want to learn more about it, who want to listen in so that they can educate people. So that's great. That's the intention of the book and the webinar series. So I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. Really nice to know that, you know, there are people here who also want to spread the word. So thank you. Great. I'm going to stop sharing. Share the results. Great. So please start typing your questions. And in the meantime, I'm going to kick off because there are a couple of questions that I have for David and Cynthia. And even though we've been working closely for quite some time, these are some questions that I haven't had the chance to ask them. So David and Cynthia, I consider you both to be amongst the pioneers in the field of climate change, with your work starting in the 1980s. Could you both briefly describe your journey and tell us what it was like to work on climate change when it wasn't the hot topic it is today?
Let's have David go first as
Sure.
the climate scientist.
Yeah. Go for
Well,
it.
so Jim Hansen did a lot to bring this to people's attention, both scientifically and also in his reports to Congress and congressional testimony. And in association with that, back in the 1980s and 90s, we went around and tried to get people interested in the potential impacts of climate change and what might happen. And some of them involved obvious impacts groups. So for example, we went to a group of foresters and we tried to point out to them that it looked like climate would be warming and potentially drying, especially in northern regions. And we said, if you have a choice, why not plant trees, because trees take sort of 50 years to reach full growth. Why not plant trees that are more heat and drought resistant? It fell on deaf ears. They said, our tree planting is completely associated with our estimate of what the demand would be. And we don't know whether people are going to want softwood or hardwood. Climate isn't even on the radar screen. We went to the military and we said, you know, sea level rise may really become an issue later on in the next century. And you have a number of bases that are in low-lying islands. Maybe you should try to be more proactive in limiting the impact of climate change on sea level rise, and also on all sorts of other problems in demography and immigration and so on that may arise. That also fell, at least publicly to us, on deaf ears. The Navy said, well, yeah, well, we were thinking of rebuilding these bases anyway. So if sea level rises and covers those islands, we'll just build someplace else. So basically what we found was that you could point out something, but everybody took it as a sky is falling sort of assumption. And we thought that as it became more evident, people would actually be taking more action. But that, as we all know, has been very slow to arise. Cynthia?
Very similar. You know what? I wish we had something for every talk that every author gave over the years about climate change, because it's not just our experience, but all of our collective experience of folks who worked on climate change early on and bringing to society again and again and again. I mean, it's thousands. Collectively, probably we have all given thousands of talks sharing the word about climate change. So that, first of all, so in a way, that's also part of the book. In a way, it's like a recognition of that. And that now, finally, after decades, really, of this outpouring from the science and the researchers and the impacts, there is now this greater recognition. So I do want to end on a positive note that there were tremendous ups and downs of lack of awareness, lack of understanding, stonewalling in many different ways. But that now, I do think, you know, tipping points are a big thing, David, in the climate science world, and I do think that there are tipping points in the response, in impacts and in adaptation and responses also. So I do think, even though of course, you know, everybody wants more and more, but there's so much now that people, after all those thousands of talks, people really now are listening. That's what I would say.
Yeah, there's a general feeling about our species that we don't take any action until we're just about to go over the waterfall.
Yeah.
And David, one quick question before we dive into the Q&A box. You know, you have seen the projections that were developed in the 1980s and the 1990s, and you know what's happening now and what's projected. What has surprised you the most, especially when you look back at what was predicted early on?
Well, so early on, we recognized that the future would depend upon the scenarios of trace gas releases. And so we came up with several different scenarios. The worst scenario was what we called business as usual, in which people would not pay any attention and carbon dioxide would still be increasing in the atmosphere the same way as it had been historically. That was the worst case scenario. And then we had several different reduced scenarios. But what has been surprising is we have basically followed the business as usual scenario, that carbon dioxide has not been limited in terms of its releases. So I think that's the most surprising thing. Perhaps naively, we thought bringing a potential problem to people's attention would cause them to seriously try to remove it. I guess we didn't fully understand how difficult it would be to do that, how the society is just so associated with its energy usage, and that the alternative energy sources would not be readily available. And so that despite people's understanding at whatever level that this was a problem, they saw no alternative. And so things have just kept on as business as usual.
I would just very quickly say on the impacts side, the rate of change, I think, is faster than what we had originally projected. And three examples: fires, floods. Think about the floods in China, the floods in Europe. What's up with that? You know, in UK, right? There's those floods. You know, in UK, you guys had UK SIP. You know, for a long time. And I think so. The interplay of it's happening, and more seriously, with surprises on fires, floods. The food is very complicated, but I also think some of, especially with the interactions with COVID and the supply chain issues, and the linkage to the climate extremes, food I think is a bit more complicated, but I would say also issues with food and food shocks.
Thanks, Cynthia and David. And I invite all the authors who are here as well. If you feel that you can take on a question, feel free to type the answer, or you can raise your hand. But there's one that I think everyone can maybe contribute to. There's a guest that has asked us, could someone please put a reference to an excellent article or book that addresses specific measures for policy measures? So, you know, if you have any recommendations, you know, please, that's something answer while Q&A by typing. Mike Rivington has a question asking what level of student prior understanding is needed to best utilize the lectures, age group, etc. Are they suitable for 14 to 18-year-old school students or more targeted at university students? Cynthia, would you like to take that on, or David?
Let's see if there's could be an author. We really want to share with the authors.
I think that these would work at a sub-college level for interested students who have skilled themselves a little bit in mathematics in a science discipline, and who are paying attention to what's going on in the real world, so that you could pick if the notes for the lecture allow for the connection to what even that age of interested students is seeing and trying to understand. There's a question on the Q&A now about climate anxiety among young people. Get them interested in learning. You know your students. Pick a topic or two or three from the book that will focus their attention and get their attention and motivate them to want to learn more. And then clearly they go well into college, university, and public lectures to community groups and churches and things like that.
Thanks so much, Gary. We have a question from Emma Yule about loss and damage. What are the key differences between adaptation and loss and damage, and what are the key knowledge research gaps related to it in your view? Who would like to answer that?
We need
Cynthia,
Salim. We need Salim. Salim is our author, who is really the leader almost in the whole world on loss and damage, our author. Just to say, this is very much a growing, and we could have put this in the emerging directions, right? That we need research on this. What's the difference? And Martin also, by the way, Martin has also strong views on the difference between impacts and adaptation, and whether there is something beyond what a society could then suffer in regard to loss and damage. I'm just wondering, Ian, is this something, or Ian or Thea, is this something you might be able to weigh in on? Yes, Ian, please. You're on mute.
Sorry. I've been very interested to follow the discussion and the emergence of the idea of loss and damage. And I would very much like to hear what Salim has to say about this. But my impression is that it is not quite all, or the other way around, it is more than it says what it is. So it tends to be talking about how much actual loss there is already present and how much damage there is to be expected. And the current policy debates and within IPCC are very much focused on trying to measure and assess that, both in total and in terms of distribution, especially in terms of distribution, because it then means who is losing most and who is expecting damage most. And of course, that leads into the question of where is the money coming from and how much money is needed to help the more vulnerable and more exposed countries cope with the costs of adaptation, to deal with future anticipated damages. And then I think quite crucially, a question of compensation for existing and past losses. So I think, to me, it seems to be under the argument about loss and damage on a more surface level, there lies the question of compensation. And I'd be interested to hear what Salim has to say about that from the point of view of that, because what compensation then leads into is the question of climate justice. And I don't think in the present structure of the book, we have a chapter that begins to address the question of climate justice. And I think that is an emerging and growing, and is going to be a very crucial issue at the international level as this problem further unfolds. Thank you. Thank you,
Ian. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but we'll try to answer some of these questions and send it along with the recording if we can. I'm just going to very briefly share my screen again so that I can tell you a little bit about the upcoming bi-weekly webinar series. So the next one, David Rind will jump into the observed and projected climate change lecture in 2 weeks. And then Tim Carter will talk about the methods for impacts and adaptation assessment. And then we'll continue to have these bi-weekly seminars, the webinars will be recorded and hosted by the NOAA Research Program Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast. And we'll notify you when the recording for this and future recordings are posted as well. And if you think this is of use, we encourage you to take a look at this. And you please use the discount code that's up there to get a 30% off. And I've been told by the publisher that you can continue to use that code until the year, so there's time. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask Rosalba to talk to us about the NASA education resources. Rosalba, over to you.
Thank you, Manishka. I put some links on the chat, and I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Yeah, so hello, everyone. My name is Rosalba. I help support NASA's Office of STEM Engagement at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. I am grateful for the opportunity to just quickly share about a couple of NASA resources that could be helpful to those students and teachers that are also joining this session. So first I want to share about NASA's climate site. This is a very comprehensive website. You can find it at climate.nasa.gov. And here you can find evidence of climate change. You can access and also download data that is relevant to carbon dioxide, global temperature, Arctic sea ice extent, ice sheets, sea level, and ocean heat content. There is also a lot of information about causes and solutions, including adaptation and mitigation strategies, articles, news, and there is a big section for resources for teachers and for students, including interactive tools, visualizations, and animations. So definitely something I encourage you to explore. Next, we have Earth Now, or Eyes on the Earth, which is a very cool tool. And if you have your smartphone and you want to scan the QR code to access it, that's one way, or you can also take a look at the chat. I put the link there. But so this tool can provide you with a 3D real-time visualization of NASA's Earth orbiting satellites. And it can let you see the latest data relevant to all of our planet's vital signs, such as sea level height and atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration and ozone. It gives information about the NASA missions that are measuring all these vital signs. You can also look at the latest events that have happened around the world. So definitely something that I encourage you to explore. And last but not least, I want to let you know about ARSET. So this group at NASA, the Applied Remote Sensing Training Group, they develop a lot of, as I said, training that is accessible and is free. Everyone can access this training. Sometimes the trainings are online, sometimes they're in person. Because of the pandemic, they're online now. But they have all these levels: introductory, intermediate, and advanced. And they have topics that range from disasters and health and air quality to land management, water resources, and of course, climate. I want to specifically highlight, or especially highlight, this training that is called Introduction to NASA Resources for Climate Change Applications, that was co-produced by ARSET and the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And it provides you with an overview of NASA resources for monitoring climate change, but they also go into the climate models that are used to assess impacts. It is a great training that was recorded, so you can watch it anytime on the link that I shared. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rosalba. It's great to work with you and the NASA STEM education program to supplement also the Our Warming Planet and Climate Impacts, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation. we're just at the top of our hour. We want to have a brief word from David, from Manishka, and I'm going to close out with a quote actually from Colleen Vogel and Gina Zervogel, who were on, Gina was on earlier, just to round out and finalize the program. So if you can stay on just for like 2 or 3 more minutes, David, over to you for your final thought.
One, I would like to really thank all the climate impact researchers. This is a very tough job because you have to separate climate impacts on what you're looking at from all of the other societal changes that are going on. Also, you often run directly against interests that don't want you to be showing exactly what is actually happening due to climate change. And it's tough work. And also, especially as far as the future goes, you really don't know with great certainty what role mankind is going to follow in terms of trace gas releases. So you don't know what you actually have to prepare for. Mitigation and adaptation, very tough things to project. So from Working Group 1, I would like to actually thank Working Group 2 for the work they do, which makes meaningful climate change to people, and maybe that will help get some action going that's really consequential.
Thank you, David. Manishka, your final thought.
Thanks, Cynthia. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Jen Evans. Jen, feel free to turn on your video if you'd like to say hello to everyone, and to Maria Dombrov, who have been helping me to set and organize this and spread the word. So thank you to you both. I just want to end by saying that I hope that this will be an educational resource that could really be useful to educators, students, and anyone who wants to spread the message about climate change. Just speaking from personal experience, I was working in Sri Lanka for 5 or 6 years, and this was, from the early 2000s onwards. And I found that, climate change projects were picking up, and I felt that I didn't know enough, or at least I didn't feel confident enough about my knowledge about climate science. And that's why I came to Columbia to do my master's in climate and society, and found that to be useful because I think for effective adaptation, it's vital for it to be grounded in good science. So we hope that this resource will be useful to all of you, because we've had such an amazing group of authors and top experts working very hard to produce not only the introductions, the slides and the slide notes, but also the webinars. So hopefully it will be an important resources for all of you and for the students you teach and for all the talks you give. Thank you.
Thank you, Manishka. I'm going to end with a quote from that Colleen and Gina, Colleen Vogel and Gina Zervogel wrote as part of their contribution to the book. At the time of writing their contribution, the surreal COVID-19 virus is stalking humanity, and it still is. Many countries are still in lockdown. The compound and concatenating risks that such a virus adds to the suite of other risks, not least climate change and climate extremes, remain pressing and very urgent. The need for swift, generative, and proactive actions rather than reactive, passive responses is being highlighted hourly. We thank all the authors. We thank everyone who worked on the book. We thank all the participants who came to the launch. We look forward to the webinar, welcoming you all to the webinar series and continuing to work together to solve, right? We got to solve it. We have to solve climate change. Thank you so much. All the best. Great to see everyone.